Hey, everybody. I am reporting live here at Podcast Movement 2024. I am in a recording booth. And I'm going to be honest, up until about 10 minutes ago, did not have a plan for this. I didn't have somebody I was going to interview. I didn't think about content. I booked it a while ago, and then I kind of realized that I should talk about something. And thanks to a little bit of divine intervention, they do something at Podcast Movement called Brain Dates, and I had my first one a little earlier. And one of the things we talked about was segments and creating a format for your show. And I think that this is one of the most underrated approaches for new podcasters or indie podcasters. They think that they need to get the big guest or just have a bunch of guests or have a casual conversation. But this fellow I was talking to, Mike, really his takeaway came from the interview with Ira Glass, which was one of the keynotes. And Ira Glass talked about how you shouldn't really think of your podcast as a podcast. You should think about it as a show. And by virtue of having a show, you can then kind of put it into segments. So like the Tonight Show, for example, right? The Tonight Show is not just Jimmy Fallon aimlessly talking, right, for an hour. It is a series of segments. It's the opening monologue, and then some like funny in between segment, like thank you notes, or the Tonight Show connections, or some funny skit that they do with Tariq or Quest or someone else, right? And then you move on to the first interview, maybe a game with the first guest, a second interview, and a musical guest to wrap things up. And each of those segments is maybe interesting to different people, right? Like I watch Jimmy's monologue every morning, right? What I don't do unless I'm interested in the guest is watch the guest. What I will usually do is if the game is interesting, I'll watch the game. I almost never watch the musical guest, right? I almost always skip that. But because the show is in segments, there's a very clear format. The people watching the show know what to expect. And it makes it more consumable, right? Because then you don't just have an hour-long show that you're releasing on the internet. You're releasing these individual segments, or you're breaking down these segments, right? So maybe it's like the front matter, right? The interview, the monologue and the first game, but then just the monologue and just the first game, right? So I think bringing this back to your podcast process, whether you're doing interview shows or solo episodes, you could really benefit from doing segments, right? And so I'm thinking out loud right now. This is probably going to get released on both the Streamline Solopreneur feed and the Podcast Workflows feed. And so for my Podcast Workflows listeners, you'll know that when I do 3 things in podcasting, that's a segmented show. There are very clear and obvious chapters. And even with the more recent format of not doing 3 discrete stories, right? Picking a topic and then talking about 3 things within that topic, there's still segments, right? And so if you're not interested in the first segment, you can skip to the second segment. But it also gives me some structure that's not the 3-act story, which is the segment for interviews for sure, for the Streamlined Solopreneur, right? Act 1 is always the setup. Act 2 is always the conflict, and Act 3 is always the resolution. And that's how I try to run my interviews. I try to do that with the solo shows too, but it doesn't work out as much. And as I'm thinking through some of this stuff here at Podcast Movement, I think segments is going to be a really good option for the Streamlined Solopreneur. And the way I might consider it or work through it is the first segment could be an interview, maybe. And then the second segment would be my takeaways. And then the third segment would be members only, right? So maybe that's how I can do interviews. For solo shows, I think that, and again, I'm really, this is off the top of my head. This is stuff I am considering this morning. And so, like, this could be terrible content. Like, maybe this is awful. I don't think it is, right? I think that this is, I have consumed, as we speak, about 3 hours of podcast movement on the first day. And I'm already thinking through a lot of really interesting things. And so I'll tell you what I'm thinking for possible solo show episodes, and then I'll give you another example. I think that's probably a good way to do it, of a good segmented podcast. And so what I'm thinking for solo episodes of the Streamlined Solopreneur is I could talk about the thing, right? Like the top, growing my mailing list, whatever, right? Then I could talk about an interesting tool for growing my mailing list. So let's say ConvertKit and the Creator Network. And then I could talk about an automation or a process improvement related to that topic, right? So growing my newsletter, ConvertKit and the Creator Network, and then when someone joins my newsletter because of the Creator Network, create automatically a different experience for them because they are coming in not knowing me, right? People who joined my mailing list through one of my opt-ins came to my website. They probably know what I'm about. But people who just kind of joined my mailing list because of a recommendation, they don't know, like, and trust me yet. And they need to learn to know, like, and trust me. So I think that could be a good way to approach my solo episodes, because I want to do, here's the rub, right? I want to do more solo episodes. I want to make it like half and half. But I fear that my solo episodes could get stale more quickly than the interview show. That is not the case for podcast workflows, because this is my industry. I'm always thinking about this. I am doing content with my clients, and I'm answering a bunch of questions. With the Streamlined Solopreneur, because that's been an interview show for so long, I am a little bit worried that moving it to a solo show where it's not necessarily my area of expertise. I think this is maybe the other thing, right? The Streamlined Solopreneur is the show that gives me the authority to be a podcast coach, but it is not the thing that's most related to my business. I've got sponsors for that. They kind of overlap. There's like definitely a Venn diagram for the two shows, but the Streamlined Solopreneur is definitely a different audience. It's a bigger audience, and so I think maybe having some segments, right? Like, I mean, parents are a big part of the Streamlined Solopreneur, or at least I want them to be part of the Streamlined Solopreneur, right? Busy solopreneur parents, and so maybe one of the segments is kind of like how I'm managing being a parent with being a solopreneur, right? So maybe it is more personal, and there's this actionable advice built into these segments. That's something I'm really thinking through. So the podcast, a podcast I think does segments really well. This is what I was talking about in this brain date, which is, I mean, I'm being honest, it's like basically a free coaching session for people who are at the conference. Shorter and not, I don't do any research on them. We just kind of have a conversation. I kind of give them my initial thoughts or like my gut reaction. That's the word I'm looking for. So, okay, so a show that I think has really good segments is Talkin' Yanks. They do kind of like three different shows, or three different types of episodes. There's the Tuesday episode where they interview Yankee manager Aaron Boone. Then they recap that conversation, their initial reactions, and maybe like things that they didn't say to Aaron Boone. As an aside, uh they get a bad rap for not being like outwardly a jerk to Aaron Boone, and I just think like the people who feel that way like don't know how to play politics, right? Like Aaron Boone doesn't need to go on this podcast, um, and so like they ask him hard questions, but they don't press him or like they're not a jerk. Like they keep it civil, and I think that's really important. And like yeah, like frustrations flare a little bit, but I think they all ultimately know like they're playing a game. And so anyway, that's just an aside. So they have the the interview with Aaron Boone. They have their recap, and then they have something called Sharp Stats by Katie Sharp. Great data analyst, does a lot of cool things. So that's one episode. Another episode is with two different hosts. So it's like Jimmy and Jake do Talking Yanks mostly, but then they do this other like shorter episode with BBD, who's their producer, and Joe's McFly, and they usually pick a topic. It's like a mailbag episode, so fans will call in and ask questions, and they'll usually pick a topic around that. So like that's like less structured, but there's structure in like having the questions. But my favorite types of episodes that they do are the game recaps, right? So the Yankees will play a 3 or 4 game series, and then after the last game, they will recap the series. And the segments there are really good. It's just like I think it's like really A+ content because they just finished watching a 3-hour baseball game, and now they are going to give their initial thoughts, right? Or they don't have time to write a script or like ask these specific questions, right? This is like, or sleep on it. Like they have these gut reactions. And so the structure and the format there is really important because that's what keeps them on the straight and narrow. And so the way this works is they intro the show, they kind of give an overview of the series. Yankees won or they got swept. And then they do what's called grounds creeping, which is like generally an injury report. This guy's injured. He's on his, he's doing his first rehab assignment, whatever. And then they get into the bulk of the show. So the first thing they do is they burn the games. So like they'll do a recap of each game and give their comments on each game. And then after those comments, they move into the second half of the show, which is awards. And so they'll do the Pride of the Yankees, which is the player that made them the most proud that series, top performer, or did something cool. It could be like Garrett Cole was one recently because of his great pitching performance that kept the Yankees in the game. And then they'll do the Yankee MFer, and this is somebody that they're essentially mad at. Like they performed very poorly. And then they'll do regular old awards, which is just like, this is I think they did like the Kingslayer award recently. Jake has been really into Game of Thrones. Or they'll do like the Make It Happen award or something, right? It's just like an awards that they invent that they want to give to a player to recognize their performance or whatever. So that show with the segments is I think if they didn't have segments, it would just be two guys talking about baseball games that the people listening probably already watched, right? And then what differentiates them from ESPN analysts or like the Yankee post-game show, right? Like what makes them different from John Flaherty and Ryan Rucco or whoever, right? Bob Lorenz, right? So I think having those segments is one of the things that makes that show so good. And then again, you have those segments and you can release them as individual videos on YouTube or social media. So this is this is something I'm probably going to noodle on a lot more while I'm here. And if you're so that's I think that's like the bulk of my thoughts here. I don't want to belabor this point, but I think if you're looking for a takeaway, and so I know this is released on both feeds, right? This could be a podcast or a YouTube show, any content, right? I think like something all like something that we all share as solopreneurs. Whether you're a podcaster or not, if you're a solopreneur, if you have a business, if you have a side hustle, that's why you're listening to this show, right? Like if you're listening to one of my shows, you're interested in running a business and creating content. And no matter what you do, I think segments can be really helpful, right? This is being recorded in Ecamm Live now. I love Ecamm Live, and having segments allows me to create these nice graphics. So it's not just like me on the screen the whole time, kind of like this. I'm like sitting on a I feel this is like I'm sitting on a couch. So if you're listening to audio only, there's like this white leather couch in here with like a colorful background, and like not my normal mic. So I hope like my editor doesn't hate the way I sound right now. I see the levels, so they're pretty good. I don't think I'm blowing out anything. This is really neat. It's called the Go Box Studio. Anyway, so whether or not you create a podcast or videos or even like blog posts, right, that you're maybe turning into something, having segments could be really good. It gives structure to the thing you're trying to create. So I think we're gonna leave it here for the main show. For members, I'm just gonna kind of give my gut reaction, things I've learned, people I've met. And if you are on my newsletter, something I teased in the newsletter that I want to think about more. So that's it for this episode. Thanks so much for listening. You can catch all of the episodes at streamlined.fm or at podcastworkflows.com. And if you want to say hello, reach out, you can comment on this episode on either one of those pages. That's what I'm going to be talking about in the main show. So if you want to become a member, hear every episode ad-free extended, you can become a member over at streamline.fm/join. But that's it for the main show. So until next time, I'll see you out there.